9:30 US, 3:30 Central European Time, 4:30 Eastern European Standard Time. We have 1 minute left, and we'll start at exactly 9:30. Maybe I'll let another minute go. Okay, so I think we are good to go. Good morning, everyone in the US. Good afternoon to everyone that's tuning in Europe and Asia. My name is Ruslan Stefanov. I'm the Program Director of the Center for the Study of Democracy. And I'd like to bid you a warm welcome to this webinar policy roundtable on tackling Kremlin's state media capture in Southeast Europe. Let me start by saying that this webinar is recorded and it will be live streamed on CSD's YouTube and Facebook pages. So please know that the rules of engagement will be in the chat box. So please check these out. We aim to have a 1-hour webinar. We will start with brief introductions, and then I will turn over to my colleague Martin Vodimirov, who will be chairing this great panel that we have, and we aim to finish sharp within an hour. Let me just say that it's been great having this discussion today. CSD is it's at the beginning of the release of CSD's report on tackling media capture in Southeast Europe. It is a report supported by the National Endowment of Democracy, and I would like to thank the whole team, including Chris Walker, who agreed to give also some welcoming and framing remarks. You will hear from him in a moment. I would also like to thank all our partners in Southeast Europe, in all the 8 countries that we covered, which are EU member states, Bulgaria and Croatia, and also the 6 Western Balkan countries. You could see their names and their contributions within the report that you could find online at CSD's webpage, as well as in our policy brief. We would like to, of course, focus today on the policy messages, so focus on what can we do, because I think the world is already wide awake and clear that Russia's and China's sharp power have been winning policies, hearts and minds, in particular in Southeast Europe and what we call the swing states of Southeast Europe. I mean, if we've seen this battle between democracy and authoritarianism, in particularly spike in the past months and year during the pandemic, where we've seen, in particular in the Western Balkans, that China and Russia have been able to win that war. And part of this is, of course, the capacity to wield this sharp power through media capture in the region. And let me just briefly, because there will be my colleague Dr. Rumena Filipova will present the report later on, and we have some great experts on the panel on media capture. But let me say how Russia in particular, and China more and more, has been able to wield this media capture power. It's about 4 different elements. Ownership, which the Russians have in terms of, and the Kremlin has in terms of their messaging machine through the state-owned media, you know, like Sputnik, RT. These have been beaming propaganda and disinformation all across the region, actually all across the Europe and the world. And this has been, they've amplified this to a tremendous level. I mean, the sheer amount of the volume that they've been able to produce is 4 times bigger than some of the local outlets have been able to do. But it's more important, the other 3 elements of media capture that we've seen in the region. And these have been advertisement. Some of the largest contributors or advertisers in the region have been Russian-owned, like Lukoil in Bulgaria, or Agrokor in the Western Balkans, or Gazprom in the Western Balkans. We've seen them intimidate media into censorship and into favorable coverage of the Kremlin. Local governments or censorship, the third element of media capture, has been also very active, with leaders in both EU and non-EU countries across Southeast Europe appeasing to Russia and portraying Russia very favorably, which of course, through the funds that the governments have been providing to cash-strapped media in the region, including EU funds, have augmented this image of Russia. And last but not least, and very important, the so-called cognitive capture. The region has been very, very receptive to Russian disinformation and propaganda because of the overall historic cultural links that Russia has been skillfully using. So all these 3 vertical levels have been very well used in terms of capturing media in the region that have been portraying Russia into a positive light, and of course very forcefully kind of putting the region on to choose between its Euro-Atlantic integration hopes and the authoritarian future that Russia and China propose. And of course, China has been seen more and more recently stepping into the shoes of Russia, into these Kremlin playbook tactics. Let me say that we've provided a whole capture-proofing array of policy ideas that we hope that we will be discussing today, but I would like to single out several in terms of acting directly in the media domain. We must not forget the role of public media, that we've had in the past and that many European countries and the US has had, like the Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, or BBC or Deutsche Welle. And we must return to that. And also the power of the private sector and of civil society in terms of funding media and bringing new media funding models. I think this will come up in the discussion later on. But with that, allow me to stop and to give the floor to Chris Walker, who is Vice President for Studies at the National Endowment for Democracy and who agreed to do a welcome and a framing of our discussion. Chris, the floor is yours.
So thank you so much, Ruslan, for that introduction and also the framing that you offered for this report. I'd just like to recognize you and your colleagues for the terrific work you do, and in particular, the great work that Rumena Filipova has done on this really excellent report. And I thought what I would do at the outset in recognizing this report is just touch on three overarching aspects of the challenge. The first thing I would touch on is how our assumptions have been challenged. And you alluded to this, Ruslan, in just how comprehensive the engagement from authoritarian external actors in the swing states are, in this case in Southeastern Europe. Russia, as the report describes, has really blanketed the region with a full array, as the report says, of pro-Russian narratives and disinformation. And increasingly, China in Southeastern Europe, as it's doing in other parts of the world, is following on. And I think it's also itself defying expectations in the sense it wasn't all that long ago where much of the analysis on China's engagement in the media and information domain was framed around its emphasizing the positive aspects of CCP leadership. I think what we're seeing now are more pieces of evidence to suggest that with the platforms and the framework available to the Chinese authorities and their surrogates in the media domain, they're starting to use those opportunities to project disinformation and less friendly sorts of content into the public domain, including in Southeastern Europe. So I think the other thing I would say in terms of our challenge assumptions, and I think you rightfully exhorted the democracies, Ruslan, to invest in important independent public media, whether we're talking about Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, whether we're talking about the BBC or Deutsche Welle. I think it's important to recognize that the Russian authorities, like the Chinese authorities, put an emphasis on this activity and investing in the media domain because they really believe it's important, and we shouldn't lose sight of that. The other thing I would say is that we should recognize the larger impact on what we might understand as democracy's key infrastructure in the region. So one aspect of this are the encroachments on the media space, but I think what you and your colleagues have described in this report and other excellent work you've done is how this fits in a larger pattern of activity which insinuates itself into other sectors, including the education sector, universities, political sector, and these things don't happen in isolation. So the media and the ideas realm is one part of a larger puzzle. And then the final thing I would touch on is the complexity of the challenge. And I think what this report does so well is it spells out, both in its analysis and its recommendations, the scope of how a response might look. So the informal instruments of influence, which are emphasized in the Kremlin case, I think at one level lend themselves to regulation or law enforcement, but not in every case. And I think this really speaks to the need for what we might understand as a comprehensive response that includes both the governmental and official side, which is, in my view, a necessary but insufficient aspect of a response. What's needed going forward is a response that brings in all aspects of civil society, much like CSD and its work, but not limited to it. Because some of these challenges will not be addressed by law enforcement or by laws. It's going to require a bolstering of standards and norms, which themselves have been eroded in recent years. And in the domain of free expression, we have to be very careful not to steamroll important liberal principles and values as we address these challenges. And then the last point I would make is that this really outstanding report focuses on the Southeastern European region, but it's so clear now at this point, there's really no question that these challenges to the media and information domain are global in scope. And one of the opportunities that arises is that as more information comes into the public domain, like the research you've done with your colleagues, I think it's important to recognize that the way we can accelerate and deepen and diffuse learning is by creating new forms of cooperation and learning among democracies from different settings as a way to make sure that we can meet the challenge. I think if we aren't able to do that in a meaningful way, we may always end up just a step behind these very purposeful, focused, ambitious, authoritarian states. So with that, let me hand it back to you, and also just take this opportunity once again to recognize the really superb work done by Rumena Filipova.
Thank you so much, Chris, indeed. And thanks again to the National Endowment for Democracy for giving us also a lot of ideas on a global scale that we've been able to exchange, and we've benefited from a lot of discussion with you and your colleagues. Thanks again for sharing with us. Now allow me to turn the floor to my colleague, Martin Vladimirov, who will be chairing the panel. He's a co-author of the Kremlin playbook series that CSD has been issuing. Martin, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ruslan, and thank you, Chris, for the insightful notes on the main challenges arising of the growing use of sharp power instruments by authoritarian states and the possible measures to counter these activities. Now it is time to open a great panel with great speakers. By the way, I would like to ask them to keep their presentation brief, within 5 and 7 minutes, as to give enough time for discussion at the end. I'll make a quick note if you're going a bit over the time. Also, as a reminder to our dear attendees, you can ask your questions in the Q&A panel during the presentations of the speakers, and then I'll address these questions to the panelists during the discussion. If you'd like to address your questions directly, please raise your hand with the Zoom function next to your name, and we'll give you the floor. And now I'm really happy to turn to my colleague, Dr. Rumena Filipova, who in the past 3 years have spearheaded CSD's analysis on Russian media and influence in Europe. Rumena holds a doctorate degree in international relations from Oxford University, and will present the key findings from our latest work on Kremlin media influence in Southeast Europe. Rumena, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. Let me share my screen. Above all, I would like to thank the National Endowment for Democracy for providing us with the opportunity to examine this very interesting but also strategically important topic. I would also like to thank our partners from across Southeast Europe who were painstakingly involved in the whole research process. So in a nutshell, our report focuses on the examination of Russian sharp power through the specific phenomenon of media capture in 8 Southeast European countries, including EU members Bulgaria and Croatia, and also EU aspirants of the Western Balkans. This was based on a fourfold comparative assessment that looked into, first, the instruments of Russian media capture, second, the channels and narratives of Russian disinformation, third, the impact of Kremlin messaging on societal perceptions. And fourth, we also examined the extent to which Russian media activities are also amplified by other authoritarian actors, above all China, but also increasingly Turkey and Hungary. In terms of our findings, first of all, I would like to highlight the regional similarities. As regards the instruments of Russian media capture, it's important to know the pervasive informality of that influence. So that is to say that Russian media capture influence is not necessarily identifiable on the basis of direct ownership of local media outlets that is observable in national or international databases. To the contrary, we have seen that the Kremlin has established informal political, economic, and ideological ties to the owners of local media outlets and the surrounding content creators. And to additionally boost this informal formal influence, the Kremlin has used a number of auxiliary tools. And here I would just like to highlight, for instance, the instrumentalization and ability to manipulate advertising revenue in the media markets of the Southeast European countries. And also, for instance, the reinforcement of the existing significant governance gaps in the media spheres of the Southeast European states. Now, a second important regional similarity concerns the main pattern of the dissemination of Russian disinformation. And we have basically observed a trend whereby the more closely politically and economically enmeshed a given outlet is with pro-Russian groups and interests, then the more straightforwardly and in a more explicitly biased way that it spreads Russian propagandist messages. And we have reached this conclusion by examining 4 types of outlets, including Russia-owned outlet, partisan outlets, broader dailies, and independent dailies, which actually serve as a benchmark for how neutral or relatively more objective coverage of Russia-related events and developments can take place. And I would be happy to elaborate on these types of outlets in the Q&A session. Now, apart from this qualitative content analysis of the topics, narratives, and styles of Russian disinformation that we carried out in each of the countries under examination in Southeast Europe, we also employed an automated tool for quantifying the volume and intensity of Russian propaganda messaging. And here, one of our key findings is actually that Russian-owned outlets amplify with sheer volumes of official Kremlin discourse. And as you can see on this graph, this blue curved line, which represents Russia-owned outlet, far outstrips all other outlets in terms of the quantity of published material, in this case, in relation to the coverage of Sergei Lavrov's statements. We conducted a pilot investigation into the activity of the social media pages of the Russian embassies and also Rossотрудничество that are operating across the region. And here, one very interesting finding that comes out is that Bulgaria actually represents an outlier. So this means that the Bulgarian Facebook page of the Russian embassy and Rossотрудничество has a lot more followers and also interactions in the most recent period in February 2021, but also across a much extended period of time. So basically, it is worth exploring also in the future what are the similarities and differences of the Russian official social media strategy as opposed to its strategy in relation to mainstream media. Now, I hope that we can talk about societal vulnerabilities across Southeast Europe in the Q&A session, and just fast forward to the China factor. Again, I would like to underscore, of course, that China remains a primary actor in terms of its ability to wield malign media influence in the Balkans by virtue of path dependence and also history. But China of late has been able to make ever-growing inroads into the media landscapes of the Balkan countries, and very often it happens in cooperation with China. Now, so two of the mechanisms through which China diffuses its media influence in the Balkans. First, this is through the so-called sub-regional amplifiers. And here I can give an example with Radio Vajani, which is the Albanian language broadcast of China Radio International. And it targets all ethnic Albanian populated areas in the Balkans. Also, the second mechanism refers to the so-called national level amplifiers. And here the role of Russian proxies comes out very clearly. And I can give the example of Serbia, where these proxies can actually be located on the highest echelons of power. So pro-government outlets that tend to disseminate pro-Russian disinformation have also recently started to disseminate pro-Chinese messages. Now, apart from all these similarities that I have mentioned so far, there are, of course, important country-based differences, and they can be represented on a so-called diffusion map of Russian media capture, which can be subdivided into two categories, which we have termed susceptible enablers and unyielding inhibitors. And within those two categories, we can make further differentiations between, on one end of the spectrum, a country like Serbia, which acts as a key key pivot of Russian disinformation activities in the region. And on the other hand, a country like Kosovo, where the limited Russian presence also represents a hindrance to the spread of pro-Russian messages. Also, the differences between the countries can be grouped into so-called sub-regional clusters, which jointly augment or deflate the diffusion of Russian media capture power. So on the one hand, we have countries like Bulgaria and Croatia, which are EU members, and also they're part of a European discursive public space. So this limits the extent to which the information spaces of those countries can be flooded with pro-Russian messages. And on the other hand, we have the sub-regional cluster that encompasses the former Yugoslav space, the so-called heritage side, which is still defined by the legacies of the Yugoslav period, with state-controlled manipulation of information and still circulating messages about victimhood and enmity that the Kremlin exploits very deftly in order to sow divisions among the countries of the region. So what are we to do about the pervasive nature of Russian media capture? As Ruslan mentioned, we have detailed a list of policy recommendations in the report, which I invite you to read. And here I would only like to emphasize the transatlantic community and the role that the EU and the US can play as complementary to the efforts on the national and the civil societal level within those countries. So for its part, the EU should monitor the allocation of communication funds. Now, of course, there is a debate circulating about linking, for instance, the disbursement of COVID support to the rule of law, but there has been much less attention to the way in which EU funds have been used to entrench media and state capture networks in countries like Hungary, but also Bulgaria, which receive much less attention on the EU level. And also, of course, EU government agencies can help a lot in terms of enhancing multilateral exchange and media freedom support programs, for instance, to tech and media corps that encourage volunteering and build the capacity of civil society. So you can find our report on CSD's webpage. I'd be very happy to answer questions on the report in the discussion, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Romana, for this very comprehensive overview of the main patterns of the Russian media influence in the CE region. I would say that probably one of the most important takeaways is also that is our favorite hypothesis: follow the money. In a way, it always boils down to the links between informal business oligarchic networks and media influence. And it seems that the closer these networks are to Russia or China, the more prone they are to disseminating disinformation and propaganda. So it is important to tackle also these kind of ownership issues and financial transparency. Now, I would like to give the floor to Dr. Mariusz Dragomir, who is the director of the Center for Media at the Data and Society Institute in the Central European University. Dr. Dragomir is also the author of a very timely report on media capture in Europe, where he discusses at length the collusion between the political class and media owners, and this impact on the quality of journalism and the content provision. So a very timely link to our idea of informal networks. So I'm very happy to hear Dr. Dragomir speak. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Martin, and thank you for the invitation. It's great to be here, and also great to see a new piece of research on the topic. Yes, the work that we have done on the media capture is part of a larger research project that we have run for several years. And as you may have followed, there is a lot of debate about the issue of capture. There are already a number of studies, scholarly studies, looking into the main elements of the capture. So what we have tried to do as a more practical exercise was to really understand how capture actually works in practice. What is happening? What do you have to pay attention to understand the phenomenon, and why is that bad? So we identify these 4 components. Ruslan mentioned them in the beginning. They are more or less in line with how you apply them in your study. But practically what we have looked at, so essentially what has to happen to have full control over the media and the message in a given context or environment are 4 things. One is control of regulation and policies. And this is something that usually national governments, especially in our region, have historically had control over because they appoint the people on these bodies and they fund them. Secondly, it's about state funding. And this is these are the public resources that the governments are using to fund the media. And of course, the problem there is when this is done in a non-transparent way and it is done in an unfair way to media outlets close to the government. 3 is the issue of state media, or public media. There has been a long transition from state media to public media in our region, and unfortunately, in many of these countries, this experience was quite a big failure. And this is another element of control that governments are using. And again, as it is the case with regulators, that is quite an easy task because again, governments have a lot of control over public media in the region or state media. And finally, and this is a more troubling development, is the control over the private media. And that was in the past, we had experiences and we had examples of countries where governments and control media outlets directly or indirectly. We had cases of high levels of media ownership concentration in our region. So this is nothing new. But what we have seen happening over the past maybe 10 years is a systematic attack of groups, not only of government people, but groups of oligarchs, businesses, and governments taking over large parts of private media. And we have here a number of examples where media owned by foreign companies from Germany and other countries were kicked out of the country, and these groups took over these outlets. So if you really think about these 4 elements, you have regulation, control over regulation, you have control over state media, you have control over the public funding, you have control over much of the private media. Essentially, that is when the capture happens, so to speak, because especially those of you in the audience who have experience in journalism, you know that if you have control over those 4 things, there is very little space for independent journalism to exist in these countries. So this is how we looked at that. And now what can I say? I think that the conclusion is that 3 things I want to say. One is that this is probably the most negative development in the media sector for many decades in the region and elsewhere. And for the reasons that I just explained. And another reason is the fact that this is on a long-term development. It doesn't happen for a year or 2, it happens for many years, especially because these people, through the capture, they actually secure access to power. They win elections every 4 or 5 years. The second thing I want to say is that this is not an Eastern European phenomenon only. We see a number of examples elsewhere where the same model is being applied. We see Egypt. It's an important example. Turkey, of course. Hungary is the textbook case in Europe where this has been done over the past 10 years. We have a lot of countries in Eastern Europe, including Bulgaria, where you see forms of media capture. So this is a phenomenon that we have to really look into because it is affecting the free access to information and independent journalism. And also it starts to become, if you really notice, it starts to become the mainstream model. It's not anymore, something that is like the anomaly that we called it back in the day. Back in the day, we gave the example of Italy when Berlusconi was in power as the anomaly of capture. And now this is not an anomaly. This is becoming mainstream and the main form of control over the media, which is very disturbing. And the third issue that I wanted to say, which is linked to the discussion today and to your report, is the fact that especially in this what the media capture creates in these environments is a lot of vulnerabilities. For the disinformation that Rumena is talking about in her study, for all these forms of attacks on the media and attempts to influence the narrative, you need a system characterized by a lot of vulnerabilities, which is what media capture is doing at the national level. And this is probably the response to the question of why in some countries such narratives are more powerful than the others. I leave it there and looking forward to the discussion later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marius. This was very insightful, and I'm happy to be able to hear some of the things that we are already studying and researching over the past years. Also, in your study and in your work, would love to keep an open channel and try to find a way to cooperate in the future. Now, I'd like to turn the floor to Ambassador Fredrik Lundqvist, who is the director of the Stockholm Center for Eastern European Studies. He is also the former special envoy for countering hybrid threats in the Swedish Foreign Ministry. And in this very responsible position, he coordinated the activities of the Foreign Ministry related to hybrid aggression and analyzed how these threats are impacting the foreign and security policy of Sweden. In this respect, I would like to ask Ambassador Lundqvist to focus on what he thinks the EU and Western European governments need to do to counter malign Russian influence and these informal networks that are related to hybrid threats. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I'm very glad to be here in this discussion. I will zoom out a little bit, putting the media capture in a larger context. Disinformation and other forms of control and influence over media, information flows and narratives are part of a larger antagonistic toolbox of Kremlin. And I also want to make the point that we the West, need to have a common toolbox, coordinated toolbox to manage these threats. And the hybrid threats that I'm talking about. And the threats have increased. And the threats consist of intention, capability, and opportunity. And clearly, when it comes to Kremlin and when it comes to China, the intention has been increasing to use these antagonistic tools. The threshold has been lowered, so to say, for this kind of behavior. The capability to use various kinds of tools in a coordinated way have increased. And the opportunities, and that is the same thing as our own vulnerabilities, have been increased. And they should be seen in conjunction, these hybrid threats, also with traditional military threats. This is a continuum, a spectrum of threats with no clear divisions. So my point is that we need to see this in the larger context of an antagonistic toolbox, a malign influence and interference, in short, hybrid threats. And hybrid threats are various manifestations of threats that are coordinated and they are compound. They are designed to create confusion, to deceive, and to be non-attributable. Some of them are violations of national and international law, and some are not. Disinformation is not necessarily illegal or a violation of international law. And we must see these threats to be fully understood as part of a larger game, together with corruption, illicit financing, disinformation, control over strategic flows and assets, cyber attacks, intelligence operations, political and diplomatic influence and interference, and so forth. All these tools are a means to an end. The end is political and can be either to influence or interfere in our society or state in the political decision-making, our democratic structures, to try to influence to go one way or another. Or it can also be used to undermine, to destroy and disrupt, a more destructive goal, so to say. These threats concerns concentric circles of security. They are directed on a national level against nation states and our national societies, but they're also directed towards international cooperation, security alliances, and also in the third concentric circle, also sort of, the neighborhood. We may not have direct security alliances with some countries, but the security in those countries definitely affect also our security. And often hybrid threats are directed exactly against this international cooperation, the alliances, and the solidarity between states. EU cooperation, NATO, and the transatlantic link are obvious targets for Russian hybrid threats. And this plays out in the EU, immediate EU neighborhood, and here in the southeastern Europe, as has been mentioned. And Southeastern Europe, Western Balkans, the Eastern Partnership countries, and the Mediterranean are areas where these threats manifest themselves. And also because they are considered to be weak spots, and spots that also do not have our full attention in the way that they should have. And these threats, when they're applied to these areas, are not only a threat to the countries themselves, but also to the European, Western, transatlantic community at large. Our interest and our values, our democracy. It's a direct attack against free and democratic open societies and our open economies based on the rule of law. And therefore, we really need to pay more attention to areas like Southeastern Europe, which we have tended, I think, both from an EU and a US perspective, to neglect for some while. Not only because it's good for these countries in themselves, but it's also about our own security to be ignored at our own peril. So finally, some points on how can we address these issues and how can we manage these threats. The first point is that we need to have an increased situational awareness. We need to understand how these threats manifest themselves and to be able to connect the dots between these various forms and manifestations of the threats. Media sector is one of them, but there are many other. There are financial sector, political sector, and so forth. And we need to increase our situational awareness of this. Secondly, we need to strengthen our resilience, to diminish our vulnerabilities. This is sometimes called deterrence by denial in the security policy jargon. And thirdly, we need to develop a toolbox of countermeasures to build a deterrence posture, which is called deterrence by punishment in the traditional security policy literature. And this, we need to have a much more systematic toolbox of countermeasures. And one area that is definitely underdeveloped and which has been mentioned here, and it's mentioned in the report, concerns illicit financing, corruption, money laundering, follow the money, as I think Martin said. All these things, situational awareness, resilience strengthening, and a toolbox of countermeasures need to be applied on a national level, but also in the international cooperation. And we need to strengthen our tools for capacity building also in third countries, like in Southeastern Europe. This needs to be done on a national level, but also in the international cooperation. And I think we have now a unique opportunity also with the new Biden administration in Washington to build a concrete and operational cooperation when it comes to this between the EU and the US and with NATO, and not to be forgotten with the UK, which has quite some experience and resources in this field. And this we could call deterrence by coalition. We need to address these things together. And we need to apply a whole of government approach. These threats concerns various different areas, policy areas of our government. We need to have a whole of society approach, which was mentioned. We need to include private business and civil society. And we need to apply this whole of coalition approach where we work together across the Atlantic on these issues. So in short, my main message is here, we need to approach these threats in a holistic way, both in terms of how we understand them, but also how we address them and counter them. And to do this in cooperation. So a holistic approach is my main message here today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Lodquist. Your points are very valid, and they reflect also some of our policy recommendations, including on building a Euro-Atlantic coalition on deterring sharp power threats and hybrid threats, and involving as well private businesses. Part of the solution could be involving more Western capital investment in this region, because as societies and states are becoming captors local oligarchs would not want any foreign competition. They prefer to play with authoritarian countries, which provide them with political and financial support with no strings attached. So there is a need to also involve a wide coalition of players, civil society, media, business, and government in a broader panel, in a way. So with this, we are closing our panel. I would like to once again thank our speakers for their great presentations. And before I turn to the questions from our audience, I would like to give the floor to one of our partners in the analysis that we did in Southeast Europe, namely Vasil Velichkov, who is the founder and CEO of a Bulgarian big data and media monitoring company called Sensica. We work with them closely in order to analyze on a big data level how Russian disinformation messages have been disseminating within the region, and what are the key narratives that are coming up from this analysis. Vasco, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Martin. I'd just like to say that I really like the slogan of Washington Post, "Democracy dies in darkness," but in the recent few years, we should redefine it as to democracy dies in white noise. One very important factor that is helping the Kremlin sharp power is lubricant, is the white noise they generate through thousands of totally unofficial and anonymous websites and social media groups and channels. And this chatter actually creates a very fertile ground for all the Kremlin sharp power instruments. And tackling this under the radar threat could be compared only with tackling terrorist cells in Afghanistan and other conflicting regions. Unfortunately, the regulations and the policy decisions are lacking behind this invisible threat, just like the military doctrine of the West is struggling with these new types of threats. Part of the problem is that the corruption generated through EU funding, through government spending, generates cash flows that actually sponsor such totally unofficial operations that are just seeding disinformation and seeding even personal attacks towards civil society, public figures, NGOs, journalists, and discredit them. So tackling this goes through first transparency on a very granular level of the funding channeled from EU funds, from government spending towards various publicity activities, not just direct funding of media, not just direct funding of campaigns. Every EU fund has 1-2% publicity funding that is totally non-transparent. Also, when we're talking about policy making and regulations, the EU and the US have to be very careful, because very well-thought initiatives like GDPR regulations often leads to less transparency, especially in the area of ownership of online media domains and sites. And the only way of actually achieving a really good comprehensive policy and achieving a holistic way, like Ambassador Lodquist stated, it's through public partner partnership, because the private companies, the technology companies, the media companies are the ones that actually observe and monitor and experience all these malicious activities on everyday level. And they have the knowledge, they have the data to make data-driven policy decisions, not just political decisions. So thank you for the opportunity to say my point of view.
Thank you, Mr. Velichkov. And I would like to now turn the floor to Tanya Iris, who has raised her hand in the attendees panel for her question. Tanya, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Martin, and thank you actually to the entire CSD team, Ruslan, Rumena, Martin, to you, and to the rest for really diving in deep. And we are proud that we are able to support the work that you do. So this is Tanya Dramis-Girius. My camera is unable to function right now, and I would be happy to at least virtually see you, but it is what it is, and the connection is poor in Nigeria at the moment. But I have a couple of questions. We don't have to have necessarily answers to all of them, but I've just always wondered, and something along the line of what my previous colleague was mentioning. Do we have any account of the websites that had proliferated, the fake websites that had proliferated, and that are actually multiplying the messages that are sourced from either Sputnik or other mainstream, let's say, Kremlin tools? Do we have any data of how much of a general media landscape do these take up? Another question would be something along the lines of Rumena's presentation. I've seen that there's Kina Danas, which is the China Today. And I'm just very curious, what is the penetration of that particular, because it seems like a very niche platform. I'm just very curious, what is the general share of the audience of that particular outlet? And finally, there had been some other research done in this domain. Is there anything that you found that you seem to be disagreeing with other colleagues that had done similar research, mostly in tracking the influence in the media sphere? Ton of more questions, but I don't want to dominate the Q&A session. And always a pleasure to see a colleague, Christopher Walker, and his presentation. Although we work for the same organization, it's very hard to catch him. And so I give credit to CSD for being able to snatch Chris and his schedule and time to have you on the call. But thank you again, and talk to you soon.
Thank you very much, Tanya, and thank you for the support that you and the whole NED team has provided us in enabling this this analysis. Great questions, very specific questions. I think some of them could be addressed by Rumena first, and then maybe Frederick and Mariusz could pitch in.
Thank you, Tanya, for the questions. So regarding your question about the research that has been done, the studies that already exist, and if I understand this correctly. So in terms of our overall approach, one thing I would like to highlight as being different and as our specific contribution is that media capture is, of course, now a widespread phenomenon, as has been mentioned. But from our review of the existing research on the topic, we observed that actually media capture is discussed as an internal phenomenon, primarily as an internal phenomenon. And of course, to an extent it is. But our main aim was to shift the perspective to the foreign aspects of control and how the whole national and international nexus of state capture networks develops. So this is an area that we identified as being not as developed as it should be in a way. And regarding your question on China, here again, of course, there are issues related to how Russia and China cooperate, or perhaps they diverge. But I think our specific contribution was to highlight empirically how it takes place on the ground. And of course, China's reach is not as significant or widespread as Russia's, but these inroads are now beginning to take effect, and it starts small. So as you mentioned, Kina Danas is interesting because it's published in Bosnian, which is a language which is intelligible across the Western Balkans. So this is the amplifying factor, as opposed to just staying within the borders of just Bosnia. It is intelligible across the region, which makes it more important as opposed to other channels. Now, I can also highlight cebiz.eu, which is basically a Croatian business website. Again, very niche. We see that China starts making these inroads, and it's the China Southeast European Business Initiative that is related to this niche website. But then again, these are economics and business related news, and it can be read throughout the region. And just to really briefly juxtapose to the Bulgarian case, we now have China Today edition, which has the same ownership structure and editorial board as the Bulgarian version of Russia Today. But since it is only published in Bulgarian, which is not really intelligible across the region, we mark it out as specifically national. So in a way, it starts small. It starts by making inroads, but it has important spillovers in certain cases.
Thank you, Romana. And I would like to also apologize. I didn't mention, of course, Chris Walker can also join, of course, answering the questions. We'll be happy to hear from him. Sorry for that, Chris. We have just 10 minutes. So in respect of time, I would like to keep on message. If Frederick and Marius would like to intervene now, or I can continue with the next question.
Maybe it's better that we do a final round of interventions and we take some questions right now.
Sounds great. So I would like to relay one of the questions from the chat box. It's from an anonymous attendee, but still, did you find specific patterns in regards to the content produced by Russian influenced media? I assume that this is also a question for Romana, but we'll be happy to hear from everyone.
Great, thank you, Martin. So we have detailed our findings in the report, but very briefly, I would say that apart from all the similarities in narration and style that can be observed across pro-Russian outlets, there are these specific distinctions. And as regards Russian-owned outlets like Sputnik, like Russia Beyond, they are distinguished by the most repetitive and straightforward pro-Kremlin messaging in the most explicitly biased way. So to say that there is a flooding of messages that are entirely linked to the Russian political agenda. So to say that there is very little focus on national perspectives, on events and development that are relevant to the particular societies in which these outlets are being disseminated in their national editions. Also, there is much less of a differentiation between commentaries, opinion pieces, op-eds, and straightforward news articles, because most of them are characterized by pro-Russian bias. Now, just an important note is that of late, Sputnik, for instance, has sprinkled its pro-Russian propaganda with seemingly neutral messages, and we think that this is just to maintain the appearance of objectivity and in a way to deceive the opponent. Very briefly, in contrast to the Russian-owned outlets, we see that in partisan outlets that are published by parties, local parties that have connections to the Kremlin, very often pro-Kremlin messaging is tied to the local partisan agenda. So, for instance, if an event does not, or development which is related to Russia is not really in favor of the interests of that party, then pro-Russian propaganda can be toned down. And in terms of broader dailies, because they appeal to a wider audience, pro-Russian messages are very often linked with pro-Western ones to appeal to a wide variety of societal preferences.
Thank you, Romana. And I see Ruslan has his hand up. Ruslan?
Maybe I could speak last, but it would be great to hear from Chris and everybody else. I think Tanya would appreciate also, to get some of Chris's points.
Absolutely. And yes, in terms of time, I would like to ask maybe now for closing remarks from each of our speakers, maybe 1-2 minutes, and then Ruslan will close the event. So let's start with Chris, of course. Thank you.
So first of all, thanks to everybody for the really insightful and interesting comments on such an important topic that's central to how people, certainly in Southeastern Europe, understand the world around them, but also I think has application beyond that region, as we've discussed. One point that I might stress, and I would use this intervention that Vasyl Velichkov made about democracy dying in white noise. I think this too has challenged some of our assumptions about how the media space would evolve. And Anne Applebaum has stressed this point that flooding the zone or using the unitary position that countries or governments in Russia or China have to really use their resource muscle in a certain direction gives them certain advantages. And as we develop the sharp power concept, I think this notion of political censorship has always at root been very important to it, that there are many ways to intrude or encroach on democratic institutions and to try to harm their independence or otherwise distort or undermine the environment. But at some basic level, it's about sidelining certain discussions, making them very difficult, either by blocking them or, as Vasyl Velichkov mentioned, by creating this swarm of white noise. And I think that that's an important point here. And the response should really be about ensuring the independence and strength, resilience of the institutions that should be able to function openly, to speak openly without hindrance in ways that really has changed, certainly in the last decade or so. And so with that, I'll let others chime in.
Thank you, Chris. Mariusz?
Yeah, well, just very briefly to end with maybe some thoughts about what can be done. How can you combat capture? I think there are many solutions and many approaches. One that is particularly important, and again, this is coming from our perspective of media studies and journalism, is the literacy approach. I think is really important. It has been discussed for decades, and unfortunately for many years it was just an empty word. But I think this concept and this method is gaining really a lot of traction and importance in many cases, in many countries. We have the narratives that we spoke about. We have now a market of narratives, if you want to call it like that. Most of the governments increasingly invest in the media worldwide, and we've had for decades. But what is happening there, and I think what really differentiates, let's say, some of the outlets funded by Russia, by China, compared to others funded by the US, Britain, and so on, are two things. One is the transparency issue. And here I'm talking about operations. You have to be transparent about your operations, about who's funding you, and what are the rules that guide your organization. And the second area that distinguishes them is the issue of standards. And here I'm talking about editorial standards, how some media outlets treat journalism and news. So I think if you look at that, you have a lot of research focused on the editorial output, which is great to have that. We have a lot of studies looking into the narratives, looking into how they are disseminated, but very little, unfortunately, to date, research into the structures, the funding, the organizations supporting these outlets. So the study that you presented today is going into that area, which is great. I have seen a number of studies, so I think a lot of that has to be done in that area. And the bottom line here, I think, is really in countering disinformation and all these trends, counter-attacking with the same method, I think, is really counterproductive in many ways. The problem here is the vulnerabilities, as I said, and the health of the media system at local level. If you have a really ailing and vulnerable media outlet, these narratives will really work. If you improve that local environment and media system, I think you create the resilience that we all talk about. Thank you.
Thank you, Mariusz. And now I'd like to give the floor to Frederick. Please, Frederick, if you can limit yourself to 1 minute.
Yes, I will. I mean, this was really a fascinating discussion. So I'm going to make some very quick points here. Russia and China and similarities and differences in patterns. I think Southeastern Europe is probably a unique laboratory where we can observe this. So that's why this report and your work is very important, because I think that both China and Russia are strong in that part of the world. Second point on the EU and things can do. The EU EAS, External Action Service, has a Stratcom function for East, and they do an excellent work when it comes to Russian disinformation and this EU versus disinfo. There's also a Stratcom function for Western Balkans, but that has a much more narrow mandate, and I think there could be improvement here to work on the EU front on that. I think in other international organizations, I think when you come to OSCE, for instance, ODIHR, when we do election observation, media capture, disinformation, and things like that should definitely be part of the checklist when we look into and assess elections and things like that. A final point on this resilience. I mean, one important part of resilience is cognitive resilience. And I think media literacy and strengthening education in schools and in public and raise the awareness of these kind of issues is very important, which has been mentioned before. So I will limit myself to these remarks.
Thank you very much, Frederick. And I would like to now turn the floor to Rumena for a final statement, and Ruslan Stefanov, who will close the event.
Just really returning to ownership and finance and their relationship to the media, just perhaps a call that we have included in the report for a much more a fundamental rethinking of the funding models that we currently have, the so-called bipolar models. On the one hand, government funded, state funding, where there will always be the accusation and suspicion of government influence over outlets, and on the other hand, the private model. And in our region, this usually leads to oligarchs, local oligarchs owning media. So in a way, it's a plea, it's a call to look for innovative ways to fund media, including non-profit funding models, different and including a mix of different funding sources, and also if there is a diversity of ownership stakes, including supervision by journalists and even citizens when it comes to mostly publicly funded media, it would be a step forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Rumena. And I would like to thank all panelists for their great intervention. This is very inspiring, and I hope we'll be able to work with you soon again. And Ruslan, for final words.
Thank you, Martin, and thanks to you and in particular to Rumena for doing this great job and for leading on this report. I would urge everyone to read it in full, and of course our policy comments and also the comments from our partner, from data partner Vasil Velishkov, who are in the chat. I think they're relevant very relevant to our discussion. We'll continue digging. 2 points that I'd like to make, also taking cue from Vincent Campos' note or comment in the Q&A box. If there are 2 things that we can take away and need to do, besides all the good, the good recommendations that we've made, these will be, first of all, we need to dismantle the media oligarchic networks that are behind the concentration of this media capture, and that can only go with Magnitsky-style kind of designations and sanctions. I think the EU must follow suit with the US and be much more assertive in that respect in Southeast Europe. And number 2, public media support. We need to make certain that the EU money goes where it belongs, to quality public media. So these 2, I think, are a must. And with that, let me thank all the speakers. Chris, thanks a lot for taking the time off your busy agenda. We appreciate that we've been able to steal you also in front of your colleagues from NED. Thanks a lot for that. Ambassador Lundqvist, thanks a lot for dedicating this time. It's much appreciated. We will continue working with you. And of course, Mariusz Dragomir, thanks a lot for sharing your knowledge with us. I think you have some great insights and we need to follow up on these. Thanks again for everybody for listening. We'll have the report and also this recording on our website. Thank you again. Have a great day and a great evening in Europe. Thanks again. Bye-bye and see you soon. Stay healthy. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you.